June 4, 1942. Three American aircraft carriers are hiding northeast of a tiny coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They're waiting. The Japanese don't know they're there. In exactly 6 hours, American dive bombers will destroy 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in the span of 5 minutes. It will be the most decisive naval battle in history, a complete reversal of fortune that changes the entire course of World War II. But here's the thing. This victory didn't start with bombs or bullets. It started in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, where a team of codebreakers solved a puzzle that would save thousands of American lives and hand the United States its first major victory of the war. This is the story of how intelligence, sacrifice, and a bit of luck combined to achieve the impossible. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the carrier decks at Midway, you're about to see how America turned its greatest defeat into its most stunning victory. Let's go back 6 months. December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was devastating. 4 battleships on the harbor bottom, 188 aircraft destroyed, 2,403 Americans killed. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. But the Japanese had made one critical mistake. They missed the aircraft carriers. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea during the attack. These carriers would become the foundation of America's comeback. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day 1941 to take command of what was left of the Pacific Fleet. The white-haired Texan inherited a demoralized force and an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Japan was advancing across the Pacific like a tidal wave, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Their carrier pilots were the best in the world, with years of combat experience. The situation looked hopeless. But Nimitz had something the Japanese didn't know about. A secret weapon operating out of a basement office in the 14th Naval District Administration Building. Station Hypo, the Navy's code-breaking unit. And the man running it was about to change everything. Commander Joseph Rochefort was not your typical naval officer. He worked in a basement, wore a smoking jacket instead of a uniform, and hadn't seen his family in weeks. But his mind was sharper than any weapon in the Pacific Fleet. Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had one job: crack Japanese naval communications. The Japanese used a code called JN-25, approximately 45,000 5-digit number super-enciphered with additive tables. It was incredibly complex. By March 1942, Rochefort's team had made enough progress to start reading fragments of Japanese messages. They weren't getting everything, but they were getting enough. And in late April, they started seeing something big. References to Operation MI increased radio traffic, supply requests. The pattern suggested a massive operation was being planned. But where? The intercepts kept mentioning a target designated AF. The Japanese were clearly planning something for early June. The scale suggested it was their largest operation since the war began. But without knowing what AF meant, the Americans couldn't prepare. Rochefort had a theory. AF was Midway Atoll, the tiny American outpost that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. It made strategic sense. Capturing Midway would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and force the U.S. carriers into a decisive battle. But he needed proof. Here's where it gets clever. One of Rochefort's subordinates, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, proposed an ingenious plan. Have Midway send a fake message in plain language saying their water distillation plant had broken down. If the Japanese mentioned water problems at AF in their coded traffic, they'd know for certain that AF was Midway. They did it. Midway sent an unencrypted message reporting water supply issues. 2 days later, Japanese intelligence reported in their coded messages that AF was experiencing water shortages. Confirmation. The target was Midway. Rochefort immediately took this intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. The reaction from some senior officers was skeptical. How could they trust codebreakers over traditional intelligence? But Nimitz was different. He understood that information was the most powerful weapon in modern warfare. We know where they're going and approximately when, Nimitz told his commanders. This is our chance to ambush them. The Americans now knew 3 critical things: where, Midway; when, early June; and how many carriers, 4. This intelligence breakthrough transformed what could have been another Pearl Harbor into a carefully prepared trap. But intelligence alone wouldn't win the battle. The Americans were still outnumbered and outgunned. They needed every advantage they could get. The Americans had 3 carriers available: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. But there was a problem. Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea just weeks earlier. She was limping back to Pearl Harbor with significant damage to her flight deck and fuel systems. "How long to repair Yorktown?" Nimitz asked his maintenance officer. 3 months minimum, Admiral." "You have 3 days," Nimitz replied flatly. "Whatever it takes, I want that ship operational." 1,400 workers swarmed over Yorktown around the clock. They welded, hammered, and installed new equipment. The repairs that should have taken months were compressed into 72 hours of superhuman effort. Men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. On May 28th, Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, slipped out of Pearl Harbor. 2 days later, Yorktown followed, her hull still bearing fresh welds and patches. The 3 carriers would rendezvous northeast of Midway at a position designated Point Luck, perfectly positioned to ambush the approaching Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, the Japanese were coming in force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was personally commanding the operation. His carrier striking force, led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, included 4 heavy carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were veterans with years of combat experience. The Japanese plan was complex, too complex. Forces were scattered across the Pacific in an attempt to deceive and divide the Americans. But the core plan was straightforward: bomb Midway into submission, draw out the American carriers, and destroy them in a decisive battle. The Japanese expected to achieve complete surprise. They believed the American carriers were still in the South Pacific or back at Pearl Harbor. That overconfidence would prove fatal. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga led 108 Japanese aircraft from the 4 carriers toward Midway. The attack force included 36 torpedo bombers, 36 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming strike at 5:52 a.m. Air raid sirens wailed. Every flyable plane had to get airborne immediately or risk destruction on the ground. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 into the dawn sky. His pilots flew obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, slower, less maneuverable, and more lightly armed than the Zero. Henderson knew they were heading into a massacre. The Marines met the incoming Japanese strike head-on. The Zeros pounced on the American fighters like hawks among pigeons. Within minutes, the sky was filled with burning American planes. Henderson's aircraft was among those shot down, but the Marine sacrifice wasn't in vain. Their attack disrupted the Japanese formation and bought precious time for Midway's bomber force to clear the island. At 6:30 a.m., Tomonaga's force reached Midway and began their attack. Bombs rained down on the airfield and fuel tanks. But as Tomonaga circled to assess the damage, he realized the attack had failed its primary objective. The runways were damaged, but repairable. Most critically, they destroyed few aircraft because the Americans had gotten them airborne. Tomonaga radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. "There is need for a second attack wave." This message triggered the chain of events that would determine the battle's outcome. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had held back 93 aircraft armed with anti-ship weapons, torpedoes, and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared. Should he rearm them with conventional bombs for a second strike on Midway, or keep them ready for naval targets? At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his fateful decision: rearm the aircraft with bombs for land attack. Crews immediately began the dangerous work of removing torpedoes and replacing them with conventional bombs. Armed ordnance was being moved around on crowded hangar decks filled with volatile aviation fuel. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone reported 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The pilot hadn't identified ship types. Nagumo didn't know if he faced carriers or just a surface force. "Suspend rearming operations," Nagumo ordered. But confusion reigned on the Japanese hangar decks. Some aircraft were fully rearmed, others were half-converted, and ordnance was scattered everywhere. At 8:20 a.m., the Tone Scout plane sent another report. Enemy ships are accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo's blood ran cold. The Americans had carriers at sea, and his own aircraft were in chaos. Worse, his first strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land immediately. The Japanese carriers were caught at the worst possible moment. 200 miles to the northeast, American carriers were already launching their strikes. Admiral Spruance had made a crucial decision: launch everything at maximum range. His planes would barely have enough fuel to return, but it would catch the Japanese at their most vulnerable moment. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8. He knew the odds against his slow, vulnerable Douglas TBD Devastators. In his ready room briefing, he'd been brutally honest. If only one of us makes it through, he'll hit a carrier. May God be with us all. The American strike became scattered in the clouds. Different squadrons proceeded independently, a lack of coordination that would prove both a weakness and, paradoxically, a strength. At 9:20 a.m., Waldron spotted the Japanese fleet. His torpedo squadron was alone, having become separated from fighters and dive bombers. Waldron knew attacking without fighter cover was suicide, but he also knew this might be their only chance. "Attack immediately!" he ordered. The Zeros were waiting. As the slow torpedo bombers lumbered toward their targets at wave-top height, Japanese fighters attacked ferociously. One by one, the Devastators burst into flames and crashed into the sea. Waldron's plane was hit and cartwheeled into the ocean. Others exploded mid-air or broke apart under concentrated fire. Ensign George Gay watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. He pressed on, released his torpedo, then flew directly over the carrier Soryu so low he could see Japanese sailors' faces. Moments later, his plane was riddled with bullets and crashed into the sea. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been annihilated, all 15 Devastators shot down. Of 30 men, only George Gay survived, wounded but alive, hiding under a floating seat cushion. Their torpedoes, plagued by technical problems, either missed or failed to explode. It seemed like a complete waste. A tragic, futile sacrifice. But it wasn't. More torpedo squadrons arrived and met similar fates. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 10 of 12. Of 41 torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Hornet, all 41 were shot down. The attacks looked like disasters. The obsolete Devastators and their defective torpedoes seemed to validate Japanese confidence in their superiority. But something critical had happened. The repeated attacks pulled all the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving the high altitudes completely undefended. And they forced the Japanese carriers into constant evasive maneuvers, preventing Nagumo from launching or recovering aircraft. By 10:20 a.m., the Japanese carriers were in maximum chaos. Returning aircraft circled overhead, desperately low on fuel. Flight decks were crammed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered on the hangar decks. It was at this moment, this precise, vulnerable moment, that Commander Wade McCluskey arrived overhead with American dive bombers. McCluskey had led his 33 dive bombers from Enterprise on an exhausting search. He'd flown to where the Japanese carriers should have been and found empty ocean. With fuel running critically low, McCluskey faced a choice: turn back to the carrier or keep searching. Disobeying his orders, he pushed on. Then he spotted something: a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. McCluskey correctly guessed it was heading to rejoin the main force. He followed its wake. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's perseverance was rewarded. Through breaks in the clouds, he saw the Japanese carriers spread out below, their flight decks packed with aircraft. No Zeros challenged him at altitude. They were all at sea level, finishing off the last torpedo bombers. The Torpedo Squadron sacrifice had created the perfect window. McCluskey gave the order millions of Americans had been waiting for since Pearl Harbor: attack immediately. He split his force, assigning squadrons to different targets. Lieutenant Dick Best led his squadron toward Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. At 2,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb. It punched through Akagi's flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck among fueled and armed aircraft. The result was catastrophic. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as fuel and ordnance detonated in a chain reaction. Within minutes, Akagi was an inferno. Simultaneously, Kaga was hit by at least 4 bombs. The hits started uncontrollable fires among the packed aircraft. At nearly the same time, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown scored 3 direct hits on Soryu. Within 6 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:28 a.m., 3 of Japan's premier carriers were burning wrecks. From his hiding place in the water, Ensign Gay watched the Japanese carriers explode. The ships that had seemed invincible moments before were now funeral pyres. The bodies of his squadron mates floated nearby. But their sacrifice had made this moment possible. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer from the burning Akagi, was in shock. 3/4 of his striking power had been eliminated in minutes, but 1 carrier remained, Hiryu. The carrier had been separated from the others and escaped the initial attack. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, immediately launched a counterstrike. At 12:05 p.m., Japanese dive bombers attacked Yorktown. Despite determined defense, they scored 3 hits that left the American carrier burning and listing. At 2:30 p.m., a second wave, led by Lieutenant Tominaga, flying a damaged aircraft with leaking fuel tanks, put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's hull. Tominaga knew it was a one-way mission. He maintained his burning plane long enough to drop his torpedo before crashing into the sea. Yorktown's crew abandoned ship. The tough carrier refused to sink immediately, but would eventually be finished off by a Japanese submarine on June 7th. The loss was painful, but by then, Hiryu had joined her sisters in destruction. Late on June 4th, dive bombers from Enterprise found the last Japanese carrier. At 5 p.m., they struck Hiryu, leaving her fatally damaged and burning. 4 Japanese carriers, the same 4 that had attacked Pearl Harbor, now lay destroyed or dying. As darkness fell on June 4th, American pilots returned with barely fumes in their tanks. Many aircraft ditched in the darkening seas. Destroyers raced to rescue pilots. Admiral Spruance, cautious and calculating, resisted the temptation to pursue the retreating Japanese into the night. He knew Admiral Yamamoto's battleships were somewhere in the darkness. Better to preserve his victory than risk his carriers in a night engagement. The statistics were staggering. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, 3,057 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, 362 men. But the numbers only told part of the story. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been permanently crippled. The carriers lost represented years of construction and decades of pilot training that could not be replaced. The initiative had passed to the Americans. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. But what made it possible? First, intelligence. Rochefort's codebreakers gave the Americans advance warning, time, place, and enemy strength. Without that intelligence breakthrough, without the clever AF water shortage ruse, the Japanese would have achieved surprise. The battle might have ended very differently. Second, bold decisions under pressure. Nimitz trusted his codebreakers when others doubted. He committed all 3 carriers to the operation. He ordered Yorktown repaired in 72 hours instead of 3 months. Spruance launched at maximum range, gambling that his pilots could make it back. Third, the torpedo squadron sacrifice. Waldron and the other torpedo bomber crews knew they were flying to almost certain death. All 41 aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet were shot down, but their attacks, seemingly futile, pulled Japanese fighters down to sea level and forced the carriers into constant evasive maneuvers. They created the window that made victory possible. Fourth, timing and a bit of luck. McCluskey disobeyed orders and kept searching. He spotted that destroyer. He arrived at exactly 10:22 a.m., the precise moment when the Japanese carriers were at maximum vulnerability, with fuel and ordnance scattered everywhere and all fighters at sea level. Fifth, the result. Japan lost the initiative. They would never again mount a major offensive. The United States could now take the offensive, beginning with Guadalcanal in August 1942. But here's the larger theme. This battle proved that information, courage, and adaptation could beat a stronger foe. The Japanese had better pilots, more experience, and numerical superiority. But the Americans had intelligence, determination, and men willing to sacrifice everything for victory. The Battle of Midway demonstrated something profound. Democracies could fight and win against totalitarian enemies. The American carriers were crewed by citizen sailors, many of whom had been civilians just months before. They faced an enemy with years of combat experience and a tradition of victory. Yet when the moment came, these Americans performed with skill and courage that turned the tide of the entire war. It validated the power of intelligence properly used. It showed that calculated risks could overcome numerical disadvantage. Most importantly, it proved that sacrifice, even in apparent failure, could create opportunities for victory. Admiral Yamamoto had warned before the war, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that I have no confidence." Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His prediction proved prophetic. Today, the waters around Midway Atoll remain hallowed ground, where brave men from both nations fought and died in a battle that shaped the modern world. From Rochefort's basement at Pearl Harbor to the carrier decks at Point Luck, from the torpedo bomber crew's sacrifice to McCluskey's perfect timing, every element combined to achieve what seemed impossible. The lesson endures. Intelligence wins wars before the first shot is fired. Courage in the face of overwhelming odds can change history. And free peoples, united in purpose, can overcome any challenge. The Battle of Midway wasn't just a victory. It was proof that America had the will and ability to fight a global war and win. That lesson, learned in 5 minutes over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, remains as relevant today as it was 80 years ago.